It is my pleasure this afternoon to be working with one of my sheroes, Michelle Zager, who heads up the Treasury Executive Institute. This is a partnership between the Key Executive Leadership Program and Michelle and her team. And we have a distinguished panel for you this afternoon that is a follow-up to our first session, which was equally distinguished. That particular session, if you didn't join us for the first one, focused on the economy, health, and the environment. Today, we're going to be focusing on technology, national boundaries, and international affairs. And it is my distinct pleasure to turn it over to Michelle. I'm going to be assisting her a little bit later in the program with managing the chat room and the questions that you all will be asking beyond the presentations from our distinguished panelists. So without further ado, Michelle.
Thank you. And I'm so excited for everyone to be here, whether you're with Key or at TEI. We know federal leaders, one of the things that inspires us is that we believe we can make a difference. We believe the government makes a difference, but there are so many messages that we're hearing from press, think tanks, just odd conversations about, well, you know, with global commerce, the internet, cybercrime from all different types of players, does the state make a difference? For a lot of people, the pandemic has asked people to wonder, you know, does it ever have any close? So for the first set of questions, I'm going to ask Sasha, Brett, and Boynard to comment on how relevant is the government in 2021? So Sasha, if you would like to start.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's such a pleasure to be here with such a fun and interesting and dynamic group. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone else thinks. It's sort of fun to go first, so I get to put something out there. Certainly, we don't know what the future brings, but I'm curious to hear what my co-panelists say. So thank you so much for including me. To me, and again, my background is in the executive branch, right? I spent just shy of 15 years at the FBI, so I do have a bias about the role of government in all things, nation states abroad, and also the role of the US government here. Currently, in my role at American University, I spend my time researching and teaching cyber policy, primarily in the US, but globally as well, sort of how those things interact. And so from my perspective, just to kick off, I know there's sort of this idea of the waning role of the nation state, but I actually see it the other way around, right? So in the place where I focus, again, the need to kind of assimilate around and promulgate forward norms in the cyberspace, whether we're talking about things like disinformation, content moderation, things I'm interested in like lawful access. And the state, of course, has a role in that. You know, we sometimes think of the internet as stateless and without geography in place, but that is in fact not the case. It very much is a function of the country or region where it is, as we see with countries like China, right? You can have that kind of restrictive paradigm around the internet and limit its accessibility. And that's one role that is incredibly important that nation states play. I also think about the United States kind of coming to terms with cyber norms ourselves. And I see in particular the US government having a really important role, both in terms of regulation and legislation, but also coaching, right? Coaching the country through this process. We're at an inflection point in figuring out where we want to land on some of these critical issues. So I'll leave it at that. I know everyone probably has lots to say and I'm excited to hear about it, but I think we've got nation states an incredibly important role. Again, I think about it in the context of cyber.
Thank you, Brett. Whether the nation state.
Let me try tackling that question on a global level and sharing a concept that I've been working on for the last few years. And I don't say with any degree of satisfaction, much more sorrow, that I believe we are now in a post-American era. And that period where the United States served as a guarantor of stability and security and standards around the world has given way to what we have seen emerge over the last several years in terms of increased friction and conflict between countries. And especially at this point, where we have a new administration taking office, you are seeing, you will see efforts to challenge the old order. And I mean that in both constructive ways and in challenging ways. The Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis, the Turks, all are going to look at American leadership at this moment and try to, quite frankly, put us through the ringer. That's what we're seeing play out now in Myanmar. It is what happened in recent years, whether it was with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, whether it was with Erdogan trying to throw weight around and to challenge Turkey's commitments under NATO. And all of this did not begin with Donald Trump. I actually go back to a period in time when President Roosevelt, at the height of the Second World War, laid out his 4 freedoms and why we fight and why we defend them, where they are under threat anywhere around the world. And then steadily we stepped back from that. And it was, in the case of President Clinton, we'll defend the Kosovars from above 10,000 feet. And then certainly during the first part of this century, with the events of September 11th, the lens through which we're looking at the world became very much one of terrorism and security. Even the president that I directly worked under at the White House, I feel, especially when it came to Syria and ISIS, was more limited in a prime time to address. I remember from when I was at the NSC saying, well, we will help those who can escape from ISIS. And previously, he had, and we had defined our policy as, well, we'll help the Yazidis because they're on Mount Sinjar and we can't let them get slaughtered. And then it was, we'll protect Kurdistan because we've got a consulate in Erbil. Well, that's a far cry from where we had been before. And it certainly was not unnoticed by world leaders, both allies as well as adversaries. So I'm glad to get into more detail, but just at the outset, I want to share that perhaps somewhat pessimistic view of what the American government can accomplish on the world stage. I think we'll have a chance to talk about how this opens up both a need, but also the opportunity for the US to collaborate not only with other nation states, but with companies and non-governmental organizations, activists, citizens, because in the post-American era, while we may not necessarily be playing that outsized role any longer, we certainly can still cobble together a coalition that can help to slow down some of the efforts at trying to undermine institutions and ideals.
Thank you. Boyden, if you would comment on what you've heard in your thought about the role of nation states right now.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, whether or not we're in a post-American era, I don't know, but I do know that as a member of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, the newest part of the Department of Homeland Security that was stood up through legislation in 2018, the federal government has a big role to play for American citizens. As the nation's risk advisor, we are able to pull together a coalition of both industry and government partners and the international community to get information together, make sense of disparate cyber attacks and vulnerabilities, and mobilize with our platform and our unique vantage points in a way that really is unpeered in this space, in my mind. And so the critical infrastructure landscape has never been more complex. The threats have never been more dynamic, and someone needs to step forward as the nation's risk advisor and help make sense and help prioritize resilience activities and recovery efforts and things like that. And that is really why I think an agency like CISA has never been more relevant, and we are just getting started.
And I want to pick up on that thread and ask Krista and Ryan to comment, because there is somewhat an assumption, I think, out there in the public that we lack the technology within the government and therefore to serve our people, we're just not that tech savvy. We don't have what we need. What is the reality of the government digital experience? Are we as far behind as people think? Are we sharing the technologies and all that future type technology people hear about? Krista.
Yeah, so first off, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to sit on this panel and be here today to share my thoughts. So I think one of the unique things that I think that the Centers of Excellence at GSA gets is this viewpoint of all of government, right? As an agency that exists to support the rest of government, and specifically through the Centers of Excellence, is an agency that is engaging with different agencies, large and small, in the defense space, in the intelligence space, but also in the federal civilian space, right? We get this very broad perspective. And I think that it would be a mistake to lump all of government into a single category and say the government is or is not tech savvy. Because if you look at the nuances of every agency and even kind of the subcomponent agencies that make up those agencies, there's a lot of diversity. And I've seen agencies and programs that are incredibly advanced and have already been thinking about and already have implemented a completely digital process in which all of the information coming in and all of the information going out is entirely digital, and they are leveraging the latest technologies like automation and artificial intelligence to be able to do that. But then there are other parts of the government that the process is print out a piece of paper and walk down the hall and give it to another person, right? And so I think I agree with Boyden that I think the federal government is very relevant still. I think, however, we do have a lot of work in making sure that all parts of the federal government have the tools and the capabilities that they need, as well as the skilled people within those organizations to be able to leverage them strategically to be able to meet our mission. Because the government is incredibly data rich, right? But in many cases, I think we are very information poor. And what we really need to be focusing on is how can we leverage this swath of data that we have, get it into a format that is machine readable, and really start being able to understand it to drive how we make decisions. And when we get to that point, and many organizations already are, I think that makes us incredibly relevant, and it makes us even more efficient at being able to deliver on the unique missions of every agency, right? Because if you think about what a lot of these agencies are doing, they are taking care of our people. I know you started this off, Michelle, stating that we are all in government because we genuinely believe and care for the people of this country. And I think that that is true. I think that we still have the ability to take care of the people who live in and thrive in this country, and maybe those who don't, right? But we need to change the way that we think about delivering government services to continue to stay relevant. And I think that that needs to be data and technology, have a large emphasis on data and technology.
Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, so thank you for having me on this panel. It's a real honor to kind of be here. I've never done something like this, so super excited. And I too agree that I think that the traditional paradigm of the government is like, it's a dinosaur. It's a little slow on the uptake. It's always lagging behind slightly. But I think that you've seen in the last 9 months or so, kind of a leap towards integrating data. You see it with the CDC's COVID trackers. You see it with the partnerships with Johns Hopkins University and tracking the COVID-19 virus across the country and across the world. And you see different other agencies as well expanding their virtual working programs, given that we're all in kind of this virtual environment. And then some agencies looking at that and thinking, well, what more can we do with this moving forward? And how can that help maybe our bottom line and open up our candidate pool into the future and expand it across the country rather than being so, geolocated and locked into the DC area, for example, right? We can pull people from all over the country and get a much wider range of experience. So I think that moving forward, there's room for change and growth within it. And even before the pandemic, OPM created, I think in 2019, the data science position for government agencies, and gave them kind of guidance onto what roles those individuals could play to allow that that opening and opportunity within agencies. Because again, you got to remember that I think President Obama said that the government isn't a speedboat, but rather like an ocean liner. It takes a lot to turn the boat. So we in the government have the disadvantage of not being able to move quickly. Not only do we have a lot of bureaucracy, but we also have to contend with administration changes or and with those different secretaries coming in and different priorities. So it's a constant game of, not game, but a constant battle of competing ideas or switching of the tide. So I think that we're moving in the right direction. I think a lot can be done in regards to inter and intra-agency communication and collaboration, more integration of public-private partnerships, and getting some of the information from the private sector into the government, and vice versa. I think the NTIS, if I'm not mistaken with the acronym, does a really good job at trying to vet some of those those public-private partnerships to kind of get them integrated into the data. So I think that it's moving in the right direction. I'm optimistic. I deal with data in and out of my day quite often. And I kind of see just within my agency, we're moving in that right direction, at least starting to. But it takes not only the buy-in of the agency, but the buy-in of the people at the lower levels that are implementing these processes, and to have the processes ready. So it's, to incorporate the artificial intelligence and machine learning, you have to have good data governance. You have to have the structure set up. You have to have, most importantly, the buy-in of the people within the agency, because if people aren't willing to implement those processes, then you can have the best technology in the world and the best software and hardware, but if people aren't using it, then it's not really going to benefit the agency as a whole. So I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful, but we'll see.
And I saw some folks have put in the chat that they agree with comments they've already heard. Please remember to also put in some questions in there so we can get to you. One of the themes that I've heard from all the speakers is we need to do a little bit more collaboration, perhaps. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about what type of collaboration, more specifically, do you see us needing to take so that we remain relevant? Are there certain folks we should focus in on? Because to the point that we are an ocean liner, it takes us a while to get there. What are the seeds that we need to start nurturing right now, and what is already there that maybe we're not taking advantage of? And I open that up to the panel.
I'm happy to take a shot at that one. Thanks, Michelle. So in terms of collaboration, I think it's come up already, right? Particularly in the context of whether you're talking about tech and sort of the ability of government to manage technology to enhance its internal processes, or kind of big picture cyber or internet policy issues, right? And in both of those contexts, the partnership that's already come up with the private sector is incredibly important, right? And it's something that, in my experience, is getting better, but historically, it's not for lack of trying, but both the government side and the private sector side, interestingly, are not designed to intersect, certainly at a policy level. And it's something that I've been doing some work on, and I find it really, really interesting. It wasn't until about 5 years ago, I think, maybe a little bit more, maybe closer to 7 now, that the FBI stood up and created an Office of Private Sector Outreach, right? So as an organization, it had been around for 100+ years without having a belly button to coordinate outreach with the private sector. So if you think about that, you think, oh, that's sort of crazy, but it is an evolution. And what's been interesting too, during my time at the Bureau, and then now sort of studying these from the outside, it's getting better too, but the tech companies aren't organized to interact with the government either. And there's sort of categories, right? We can talk about procurement and procurement reform, which is its whole own thing. Those are different categories, but from a policy perspective, and again, it's changing a little bit, but it was interesting for me talking about policy issues on behalf of the government. If I go to a company like a Google or a Facebook or a Microsoft, right? Our director might talk to their CEO, and our engineers might talk to their engineers, and our lawyers definitely talk to their lawyers. But from a policy perspective, there wasn't really a place for me to plug in corporately. And that again has changed over the last couple of years. But so I guess in summary, I would say the public-private partnership piece and thinking about, and I know the departments and agencies are working on this too, how to structure one's organization so that one can plug in, and then how to find those partners where they are, right? And plug in at the right place. And that kind of co-evolution, particularly in tech, which is so relatively young, is a really interesting challenge, I think, for the government going forward.
Michelle, if I could offer a couple thoughts on public-private partnership and just engagement across the Rubicon. I found, having spent 12 years in federal government and now 6 out in the private sector, the first challenge seems to be that we overcomplicate things. So we don't need, in most cases, and I'm sure the lawyers will be after me after this, we don't need a formal PPP agreement to collaborate, to communicate, to coordinate in some way, shape, or fashion. And often what I found as most useful, whether it was serving in an embassy overseas or the incredible power you have in the old executive office building to convene people, is to bring those stakeholders, both traditional ones and some non-traditional ones as well, in on a regular basis. Share what you're working on, get their feedback and ideas. And here's the interesting thing. When people become familiar or more familiar with what you're doing, they have a tendency then to become ambassadors of that work. They have a tendency to share the insights and the understanding that they've acquired. And often in government, especially at a federal level, we don't have to create a PPP agreement. We don't have to do a grant or even a contract. And in fact, many times we undermine our efforts by doing so, for all the reasons that the folks on this webinar will be familiar with. It's not sustainable. It doesn't outlast the time of that contract, that grant, that agreement. Whereas if we say, here's a problem over here, how would you endeavor to fix it? Then all of a sudden we get ideas, we get initiatives, and we can help to inform that. But we don't necessarily have to join each other in marriage forever and ever. Because at the end of the day, as everyone is familiar with, the private sector, especially in technology, wants to move fast. So how do we at the federal level keep up with them, ensure that they're not like driving the ship off the dock in some ways or into troubled waters, but we can generally kind of stay aware. And I think, in the FBI, in CISA, in other entities across the government, GSA, Railroad Administration, I think I got everyone, there are efforts to have that more regular communication. Now, the last thing that I will say is it's also how we're talking. And I remember sitting at a off-the-record session at one of the think tanks here, and my former colleagues, many of them, were just complaining about, the private sector doesn't get us. They don't understand what we're trying to do. And there are a couple problems. One is you bring them in too late. The private sector doesn't want to be brought in after you've shaped this very wonderful federal program and then be told you plug in here. We've got to bring them in earlier. And then on the flip side, we've also got to figure out a way to communicate, not as we do in acronyms and in large policy proposals, but I've discovered in my transformation from the federal sector into the private sector is I had to learn a whole new lexicon, because what we used to describe, even in my case, public relations in the public sector and public relations in the private sector, completely different. So how do we help to understand each other by maybe, trying to find new, different ways to communicate? And again, reinforcing the first point I made, if we describe what we're doing, and if those in the private sector listen to us, we then hear back from them, how would they describe it? We need to be attuned to that, because rather than then trying to fit that description back into our federalese, we could use that and we can then take it out to more and more people. And I think we could find ourselves with a lot more partners.
Does any of the other panelists want to respond to that question? And what does
Yes.
collaboration look like?
I'm happy to speak to that. So I am absolutely glad we've been having this conversation around public-private partnerships. And I agree with a lot of what is being said, in that the government and private sector are not speaking the same language. And when we want to think about, right, one of the things that I think about is, what does the government look like in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years, in 50 years, right? And I think that we have to be engaging with the innovators of the world, right? If whether we like it or not, innovation is coming from the private sector, and it's changing the world around us as we see, right? Just think about what your smartphone can do now that it could not do 10 years ago, right? It's changing so quickly, and that imbalance of how quickly the private sector is changing versus how slow the government works, I think can be very hard to overcome. And I actually think that, like I said, I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made, but I also think that one of the ways that we can overcome this is not just communicating outward and partnering with the private sector, but actually also partnering with each other, right? Because if you think about the hard problems that government is trying to solve, certainly some of them are very niche, right? And are very unique to the mission of an individual agency. But there are also many functions that all areas of government have to deal with, right? And so I think on an implementation level, right, there are things that we can learn from each other. And there are deliverables that we can leverage, right? We don't need to recreate the wheel every time we want to solve one specific problem, right? When we elevate these problems to a space where we can bounce ideas off of each other, and even if somebody hasn't solved your exact problem, right, that an agency is facing, they've done something similar. They've thought about this. They have dedicated hard government resources to being able to figure this out, right? And there's just no way to share that knowledge right now. And I actually think that a mechanism of sharing with each other can be through these public-private partnerships, right? Because when public-private partnerships exist across government, and when we communicate across government, those lines of communication between all parties become more open, right? And I know that's very high level, and it isn't necessarily a how-to guide, but I do think that these open lines of communication are a really critical part, because I think, to Brett's point, we're making it harder than it needs to be. And one of the reasons is we're just not communicating in a way that is able to be consumed by people who are not in our very niche little world.
And Reggie, I see we have questions coming in on the chat, so maybe we should pull over to the chat to get their thoughts incorporated.
I think it's perfect timing, Michelle. Quite a few things have come in. Let me go back to, I guess, something you alluded to earlier, and that was a comment by Beth in agreeing with Krista's perspective on how government does or does not use data effectively. So that was certainly one of the points that was raised by our audience. Big Dahlia says, absolutely, coming from the private sector to the government was extremely hard. Felt like a bull in a china shop until I got it. Now has become my key that opens door. Spend the time teaching both sides in order to make things work. And she had an earlier comment. Let me see if I can find that now, because things are coming in fast and furious.
Can I respond to that comment, by the way, while you're looking, Reggie? You know, this year, with the government looking to respond nimbly to the pandemic, we at CISA had a really interesting opportunity to quickly onboard some folks from the private sector under some special legislation that cleared away a lot of the red tape, so we could get some folks from the healthcare sector that were very savvy with the sector that we didn't traditionally work very close with. And that was great. They were cybersecurity experts. They had a lot of expertise in that sector that we did not have organically at CISA. And through many of their initial conversations trying to make sense of this is a landscape, I would repeatedly hear them say that comment about we fear being a bull in the china shop, and we fear that we're going to step on toes, we're going to make a mistake, we're going to say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and then the hierarchy is going to sidebar us and we'll get nothing done. And what I wanted to just share to anybody who's coming into a federal agency and has a new point of view, you know, when you broadcast that your intent is good to the people you're working with, and yet perhaps you make a mistake that makes you appear like you're a bull in the china shop, I think that can be tempered. So I really just want to encourage anybody who's bringing new ideas to the government to not worry so much that you're going to be offending people and perhaps get the train off the rails. Really, the most important thing is bringing that truth, speaking that truth to power. And if you're careful about just, you know, caveating it with this all comes from a place of trying to do the right thing for the American people, I think it will go a long way to diffuse some of that tension that you fear that you're causing.
Thank you, Boyden. I did find that other comment or question by Migdalia. It says resiliency, collaboration, revisit our current processes, all sound good. However, attempting to make change requires long-term planning and execution. That being said, how can execution continue when there is a constant flux of leaders, appointees who come in every 4 years and want to make a name for themselves, hindering the movement forward?
So I could take a stab at that. I know I've been with the federal government for going on 15 years, 5 with the military, and then now going on 10 or so with the federal government in DC. One of the things that I think agencies tend to rely on heavily, and rightly so, is the SESs and those career level individuals within it, that they can kind of steer the organization and have the overall goal for the organization in mind, or for the agency in mind, and that can kind of span the different administrations that come through to some degree, right? So sometimes little things will change, and you might kind of get veered off what their goal was. But the big thing I think too is just trying to keep in mind that everyone that's coming in is trying to do what they believe to be the best for the nation, right? We're all in federal service because of the great paychecks, right? It's for the fact that we're serving the American people, right? And that's what kind of unites everyone in the government together. And if we keep in mind that our goals should be kind of tempered to the fact that we are public servants, and that our goal is to serve the nation and serve the public, that we can try and work our goals in with the new oncoming administration, so that we can continue the path. Instead of it being maybe so narrow-minded, it can kind of be a little wider, so it can encompass both their goals, the new administration goals, and the goals that the agency had set forth prior.
Thank you for that, Ryan. Okay, let me move on. Another attendee indicated coordination, policy, intersection, great. What mechanisms are in place to enforce or ensure the cooperation we need?
So I will just plug my own organization here just for a second. So the Centers of Excellence is part of a broader group called the Technology Transformation Services within GSA. And really the entire purpose of this organization is to engage across the federal government. And I think one of the strongest things that we are able to offer actually through our digital.gov services are communities of practice that reach, that are open to everyone across the federal government. It's not a perfect solution, I will absolutely admit it, but I, for example, lead our federal AI community of practice. There are communities of practice around open data, around DevOps, around APIs, and then a number, I want to say there's 20 or 30 different existing ones, and you can create new ones. And these communities have a lot of freedom in what they're able to do. So one of the things that I've really been pushing around AI in our community is really literacy is a big challenge when it comes to adopting these technologies. And so we've really been pushing on literacy in, for example, the acquisition space, the data operations space, sharing of best practices and lessons learned, how to pilot things, right? And it's not a cure-all, right? But our community is over 1,000 people strong. And I personally have received emails saying, this person came and spoke at your community. I'm really fascinated about it. Please connect us. And those connections have turned into projects, have turned into new pilots around the government where they did not exist before. And these different communities, I think, have the ability to bring people together. And again, it's not a cure-all, but it is a space. And I think that we should be leveraging those spaces to really be driving that communication. And I think that that's also a space where we can start bringing in partners, right? And I know there's special rules around when industry can come in and when they cannot, but right, this is a good space to start asking questions and having those, I think to Brett's earlier conversation, not necessarily formal agreements, but just having an open conversation around challenges, around what are things that are solvable, what are things that are not solvable, right? And looking at all these different externalities and trying to address what can we focus on, what are things that we can move the needle on, and what are things that we cannot. Again, I think that's one avenue. I am curious to hear what the other panelists have to say, because it's not the only mechanism, and it's certainly not the best mechanism.
I would just say on internal cooperation in the federal government, we could go a long way by simply setting aside our feudalistic tendencies in the federal government. I mean, one of the things that drives me nuts, and this was just when I was at the State Department, is that every office, every bureau certainly had their own logo, and they had their own way of referring to themselves. We're IRM, we're DS. No, you all technically work for the Secretary of State, and oh, by the way, we all work for the American people. So can we set aside a little of that territoriality? I remember one of my favorite terms in these meetings, interagency policy committees, was, well, we have equities. Well, technically, we all have the same equities. So can we figure out ways, and I think this is a critical juncture, potentially an inflection point in the federal service with this new administration, with this rethinking, potentially reform going on, of how do we do things differently? And I want to encourage those that are career staff on this call to not be passive observers in this process, but to be assertive, and really to try and propose new ways that we can collaborate, cooperate, and also just thinking, obviously, of ourselves. One of the things when I would teach federal executives is, yes, you may not be able to steer the entire cruise liner in a different direction, but you can definitely start on the deck or in the galley or wherever your particular fiefdom may be. And then one of the interesting things in the federal government, at least I found, was that positive progress tended to replicate itself. And others would look at it and say, wow, look what GSA is doing. Chris is awesome. We got to do more of that over here. And then the other thing that I really, really hope we can finally get over in the federal government is our aversion to risk. Some things are not going to work out, and it's okay. But this constant risk aversion, you talk about the difference between private sector and public sector, we have to take some calculated risks. We have to articulate them to our leadership, we have to articulate them to Congress and to the public and the press and those who might be critical of us. But if we do not fail forward, we are always going to stay in the same place. And I think there would be real value in us finding a way in the federal government to articulate, yes, we are going to make investments. They may not yield dividends. We're certainly going to learn a lot from that process, but let's articulate the value of doing those things. And I think it also starts again with the leadership, whether it is a GS9 or all the way up to the senior executive service, exerting leadership and encouraging their team to take calculated risks, to learn from those risks, and to move us forward.
Thank you for that, Brad and Krista. That was excellent. As someone who spent 35 years at the federal level and a few years at the state and local level, This next question certainly resonates with me, and I think it will with you as well. So I'm really looking forward to the answers on this one. Beth says, you might see Beth's question is a little cynical, but she says, it feels like the government is always behind the curve, always reactive and not proactive. To what extent is this a failure of leadership? And what can your average federal cog do to make a difference in this area? And Brett, you were speaking to that to some degree, and I think you were too, Krista.
I think having an impact, right? Having spent 15 years a cog myself in different capacities and different levels, but at the end of the day, everyone's got a boss, right? And everyone lives within a system that we think about having sort of political, managerial, and legal parameters set upon you that are different in the public sector, right, than they would be in the private sector. And I guess two things. I grew up, my stepdad spent a career at the VA as a social worker. And what he would talk about at night was that he would see those challenges as part of the process, right? It wasn't that his job was just to get the thing done. His job was to get the thing done in that complicated context. And he reveled in that process, right? He was like, listen, and then we had to do this because the policy that, and then these people and the fiefdoms, right? And I got it. And so I brought that to my service. I wasn't always successful, but I think a lot of the people I see who are successful having impact as cogs, if you will, which we all say lovingly, is that seeing that not as simply something that is wrong or has to be overcome or broken through, but as part of your job, right? And approaching it with that, I think, I see it, first of all, it's less frustrating, is what I learned. And I do think it yields more impact. And at the end of the day, for me, whether I was working at the FBI or then when I got to experience the interagency and see what was going on at the NSC, again, it's really two things, right? It's the process pieces that Krista talked about, those interagency working groups, those finding those best practices, those formal communities of interest that I'm a huge process person that I think helps so much. And then the other piece is just the people, right? And the leadership and the trust, right? And I always joke, I always knew the FBI ran on trust and relationships. And then I realized, oh, the White House runs on trust and relationships, and the private sector does, and universities do, right? We can't take that piece away. So as an individual, building those relationships across those fiefdoms that Brett was talking about and being able to reach out and solve problems or put in place those processes that Krista was talking about that build on best practices and connect people. And then lastly, just sort of approaching it all as part of the job, right? And not just something to be jumped over, or sort of the best thoughts I can offer on that.
So I'll also chime in as a cog myself. I'm not anyone big in my agency. I'm definitely a cog. And I think for all the cogs out there, the best thing to do is when an opportunity does come up in which you're given an opportunity to demonstrate a path forward, a change, to try your best to articulate why you believe that this is the best path forward, and to support your case. And as Brett kind of said, be willing to fail, like take that risk and show it and say, you know, this, I think we should take this approach. Here's why I think this is the best approach for the agency, and more importantly for the American people, because again, those are our audience. At least, you know, for what I do is we try and put information out for the public and our shareholders or stakeholders. Sorry, not shareholders, our stakeholders, and take that risk. And sometimes you'll be met with, no, we're going to go this direction. This is the way we're going to kind of push it, and that's what it is. But there are those times in which you will get through with your idea, and you need to have the confidence and the backing to follow through with it and show why it's good. And then, you know, that's that little one in. And I think that it takes a lot of those little one-ins to make a change within the federal government, just because it's such a large entity and there's so much going on. And like I said earlier, it's an ocean liner, right? So it's a small course corrections. You can't make a big one. You got to do a lot of small little things here to make the ship turn. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. Chad wants to know, how do you properly incentivize the public sector to engage in long-term endeavors when careers and positions are short-term?
Well, and this, again, I would say is a moment. One that I hope the new administration seizes. I've been a little bit critical of them in the last week because I haven't seen the investment, at least when it came to my former department, in the current career staff, the elevation, the empowerment of them. Because at the end of the day, and I was on a talk this morning with a group in London, and we were describing the challenges on a foreign policy front with Russia, China, Saudi Arabia. And if we want to compete, if we are looking to be able to truly, certainly from a national security standpoint, solve these big problems, then it has to come from putting in place and empowering the federal workforce. Because as we all know, the politicals come and go. They have shorter time frames. I've been trying to explain this to reporters over the last week, why somebody, even if they formally served, and I'm glad that they're back, but their time frame is quite different. Their incentive structures are quite different than somebody who is looking out over a decade or longer, and who also has a group of people who they have cultivated and who they can help to rise with them. So my message to folks in presidential personnel and into the various levels of decision making on this is, let's first look at current federal employees. And then if you can't find within that group the requisite skills or experience, then and only then should we start looking out beyond the federal workforce. I also would say, just to my former federal colleagues, we have to rethink, in my view, how we evaluate and we incentivize our own staff. I remember that everything, at least again at the State Department, seemed to operate on a one-year cycle. And we were almost discouraged to say, well, anything that's going to take longer than a year, you really shouldn't waste the time with it, because you want to be able to show the results at the end of that year on your evaluation. And you certainly don't want to be able to just continue the work that your predecessor was involved with, because that won't look as positive in your evaluation as you having created a whole new thing. And so what we get across the federal government are many small whole new things rather than a larger effort to continue. And I think, again, that comes from the leadership level at all stages of a process, and saying, how am I, as a leader, indicating these are the things that you're going to be measured on? And these are what are going to be important in your evaluation, so that ultimately, and I hope that we get more towards that space where we're saying, yes, there was a good program here in place. These are the goals we're driving after. We welcome new ideas. We welcome improvements. But you are not going to be judged on solely what new things you create, but how are we collectively advancing the ball to the goals that we've got as an office, as an agency. I think we've got to build more of that into the structure of how we're evaluating ourselves.
I couldn't agree more about the value of existing federal employees and using that talent before we just go outside. But someone just posted what I was thinking too, which is that sometimes does create a diversity problem, right? A diversity of ideas, a diversity of people. And so it's a real balance. I'm with you again. There's nothing that, obviously it's a career cog. There's nothing that drives me more crazy than folks coming in and saying, step aside, federal employees who've been working this a decade, like, let us tell you how to do your business. But on the other hand, I have seen, particularly in the national security space, the sort of propagation of the same kind of both thinking and people. And so there is that balance of the diversity question versus the expertise question. And I saw that comment and I had to jump in. Sorry, Reggie, back to you.
No, that's quite all right. So I got back to Christine's original question, and it's, she says it's important to note that private sector and the public sector are both bureaucratic. The difference is the private sector evolved quickly past that. Rather than having the mindset that public sector needs to catch up to the private sector, we should engage where they are now and evolve with it. It's evolving too quickly to overcome the gap. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that. It's more of a statement than a question.
So I'll just make a small comment on that. So the benefit that the private sector has is competition, right? If you don't adapt, you go out of business. You no longer exist. There's nobody else out competing with the federal government to govern the people of this country. And if we don't adopt, we don't go out of business, right? And so I think that we need to talk about, when we talk about incentivizing people, we also have to talk about incentivizing organizations, right? And I think that that takes a different type of thinking in leadership. And I think that it takes, I remember, Sasha, you brought up earlier, bringing in public and private, or leveraging public-private partnerships, not just on individual problems, but about how do you structure your organization? Because I see, and especially I'm wearing my IT cap, and I saw that there was a comment in, or a couple comments specifically about how IT shops are structured, right? We got to change those. They're not structured in a way that is in any way, shape, or form compatible with how the private sector delivers IT services. And I think at this point, we're beyond we need to adopt. We need some radical change. And radical change is very scary. But I think to that point, I think we need some cogs who don't think they're cogs. I think we need cogs to come out and say, I'm not a cog. I am a leader. I have ideas. And I mean, I think this was also addressed, right? Like, we need some risk takers, and that's hard. But also the consequences, the federal government's not going to not exist if we fail. So let's take some risks.
This is from Greg, and some of this a failure of funding priority rather than a failure of leadership. Oh, is some of this a failure of funding rather than a failure of leadership? He goes on to say also, does the Endless Frontier Act do anything to move the needle on technology between private and public? Perhaps not if it is too narrowly focused on academic end of things.
In response to Greg's comments about the priority of funding versus leadership being the issue, I feel like that's hard to pull those apart. You know, really, it is the responsibility of leadership to get the funding prioritized appropriately, even if that means going through the Office of Management and Budget and to the White House and to Congress to get that funding allocated in a new way that's actually more relevant because the original program is no longer serving. I feel like this is particularly relevant in the space that I work in, which is cybersecurity, where programs that we conceived of, 10 years ago are not meeting the needs of today. And, the cycle for authorization and appropriations is just as much of a cruise ship as is the executive branch. And so that is really, to borrow some of the great phrases that my fellow panelists use, if the folks you're working with at Office of Management and Budget or the Hill don't speak your specific mission language, if they come from the private sector or they don't come from the executive branch or they don't come from national security or from cybersecurity for that matter, it's really incumbent on you to make the case in a way they can understand. That's really why I love that Plain Language Act that was passed so many years ago, to really speak in a plain language way that real people understand, as opposed to sort of the gobbledygook that we speak in the federal government. That's in fact, I think back to my first class at Key, that I learned that anything that gets between you and your audience is your problem if you're not communicating right. So it really is incumbent on leaders to make their case in a way that lands. And back to another question that was asked, the tyranny of the urgent always supplanting strategic prevention. Again, that's a leadership responsibility to make a case that the spotlight needs to stay on prevention as opposed to always going to response or reaction. And when I say leadership, that's whomever has the pen or whomever can seize the spotlight to make that case, not just necessarily the executives.
Thank you, Boyden. This may be one of those cogs that's trying to think outside the box. So the question posed is, how about turning this on its side? Instead of government this, private sector that, how about the two in partnership first coordinate on a common vision for the nation, then it may make sense to divide up the funding, policy, profit parts in order to get to that goal.
So I would find myself in agreement with the sense of the question. And I think there are too often limitations in how we look at funding, especially in the federal government. We dealt with it, I remember, in trying to negotiate out budgets with OMB and NSC. And there is this preset in most parts of the federal government to, well, what we already have, we can't lose because that's, money that we have guaranteed more or less. And so anything new that you want to introduce, we've got to find new money for that. And to Krista's point about differences between the private sector and the public sector, it just can't work like that. I mean, we cannot continue to spend tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on programs. Doesn't mean they're not important programs, but are they the priority programs for this moment? And I'll give you an example. We struggled a lot in trying to reduce funding for the Fulbright program when I was at the NSC, and people may or may not agree with it. But the argument we were making was that while the Fulbright program is an important exchange, we spend approximately $100,000 on each person we bring in to the Fulbright program. We could spend that money doing 5, even 10 exchanges that were shorter. And we could reach so many more people. So how do we think about our funding? And some of this stuff is intractable. You get the budget line and it's hard to reallocate those funds. But I think we can get more creative in the federal government. I think also much of this can come, and my suggestion, having sat at the NSC, is once you have that top cover, you're often able to move things faster and farther. And what I didn't see enough of when we were out looking for deliverables, looking for ideas, were agencies that were coming to the table saying, I've got a good idea. We have some money either that we already have, but we would like to reallocate, or even we would like some new money. But bake those or pre-bake those ideas ahead of time and have them ready for the moment when something's coming up on the agenda of the White House or even of your agency's leadership, saying, "Ooh, we got something." And that is so much easier to advance than to try to share the idea in a meeting and then get it fleshed out in time. The other thing that I would say is, to the questioner's point, we ought to look at private sector resources. Again, this doesn't have to be a government program. And how do we, for instance, use government resources more smartly? So maybe we don't pay for everything or anything. Instead, I mean, we did a $1 billion initiative when I was at the White House on entrepreneurship. And it was all about how we were trying to drive private sector investment into entrepreneurship. We're playing the role of the convener, we're playing the role of the catalyst and even coordinator, but it's the private sector that is helping to achieve our goals. And so we don't necessarily need to spend federal dollars on every problem, but I bet you will find once you bring different people together, and I've discovered when I was in the federal government, we're often the only one who bring together even people in the same sector around a common problem, because the weakness of the private sector is they all stay in their own camps, and they, for competitive reasons or just for a lack of a time, they never get together. So by bringing them together and saying, hey, we have some common interest here, you have some common interest, let's figure out how we allocate our resources smartly. I mean, I have very large companies as clients now, and they would love that. They would love if the Treasury Department said, hey, we want to work on financial inclusion. What could you guys do? What are you doing? How can we align it up so we're, again, it's not a formal public-private partnership, but it certainly is something that, one, the federal government can take credit for in a press release, which these days counts as, impact. And two, it may allow you to reduce some of the funds that you have to spend on that problem.
Thank you, Brett. And I think you may have offered already some good advice along this line, but since it's in the same general category of what you were speaking to, Beth specifically directed this to you. She said, let me know if you have suggestions on how to assert myself on this. I work in budget and it's often like a food fight.
Yes. No, I guess bring more pudding would be my recommendation. Pudding's always good in a food fight. So, you know, I would say both from the scars that I still bear from federal budget fights, as well as what I've observed on the outside, I think there's a way in which we can help our federal colleagues to see the bigger picture. And there are a variety of tactics that we can deploy to do that. So are there ways in which, again, if the preset is, I want to preserve my budget, I want to preserve my equities, how can we do that, but while at the same time trying to achieve different goals? And maybe we can empower them to think about ways that the funds stay perhaps within their control, but we're able to push them towards some new ideas or innovations. The second is, and again, this takes some earlier work, but how, for instance, can we convene a process that brings in different federal agencies or brings in those outside actors and say, like, we're all working on this one problem. In our case, it was entrepreneurship, global entrepreneurship. And it was amazing the duplicativeness that was happening in the federal government. And nobody wants to talk to anybody else about what they're doing. If we just took the time to do so, we could find out, hey, you're working on a program that is kind of overlapping with the program we're working on. And how do we ensure, even just for our own self-interest, that we are not going to waste money, certainly? I mean, I remember I had to engage in a bureaucratic battle over whether or not an agency was going to spend $1 million to duplicate a website that another agency had already created, but they wanted to have their own. And this went all the way up to the National Security Advisor over a website, over something that was already there. So how do we help people to help themselves in the federal government? Because that agency certainly could have used that $1 million to do something else. And I think part of it is trying to zoom it out, zoom out the conversation, bring in other actors so that it becomes less of this, for lack of a better way of describing it, this provincial conversation. And it's more about the big picture. Because if we can help people to see the big picture, I think we can make more progress.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? If not, I have a very good question that you can all take a shot at. This is from Abigail, and she's saying agencies with more traditional IT leadership are often refusing to approve any cloud-based services that aren't FedRAMPed. As we know, that process takes years and years. What would you recommend if you are facing an IT shop that isn't able or willing to review and approve new and necessary software and services? Feels like we're fighting to improve with both hands tied behind our backs.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind in response to that question is, again, it goes back to, making that case, which ultimately, if it's better, should prevail. And if you need to bring in your leadership and arm them with excellent talking points so they can, get your CIO or whomever it is that's standing in the way of your authority to operate, that's what you need to do. Or maybe you even need to go above your CIO and make this about the operations of your organization not getting the mission support that they need. And that there's no way that the most senior leader in the organization is not going to take that kind of a statement very, very seriously. Also, there's ways to do pilots that don't require such an elaborate authority to operate. You can assume some small risk to do some small pilots and things like that. That maybe is a compromise that your team can strike with your IT shop. but there is a enormous effort to incentivize departments and agencies to use more cloud resources, and it seems to me that most departments and agencies would really want to find ways to embrace that and not fly in the face of it.
A statement from Greg. He says, it seems a lot of the performance evaluations and constructs for federal employees do not have the ability to accept risk. Accordingly, people do not take on risk and do the safe things, even for those stretch goals.
Yeah, I think this is something Brett talked about earlier, but into the earlier question about incentivizing long-term investment or long-term planning or things that have long-term impacts. I am a fan of sort of small s strategic planning, the light, the flexible, and yet the super helpful kind of business process of strategic planning. And to this question, thinking about not just defining the logic model of the impact you're trying to have in the mission space or for your entity, and then defining how you're going to get there, right? But this question about how to measure and then connecting those measures with individual performance reviews. It's something we went through at the Bureau. It's extremely hard and complicated in practice to do effectively. But I think to this question, even thinking about it that way and taking a look at that and working within your organization to think about how the incentives are set up, right? Whether they're overt incentives that are included in those performance plans or sort of cultural incentives around moving people around or creating generalists versus creating specialists or all these sort of cultural incentives that are set up. It's sort of where the rubber meets the road in the ability to drive toward longer term impact for sure.
Thank you, Sasha. And Robert spoke to a similar thought about that. He said, targeted evolution might be the balance. Private sector is beholding to shareholders and maximizing returns. The public sector, as we all know, is accountable to taxpayer dollars and the related accountability. This drives much of the processes that often delay procurement, IT transition, et cetera. The balance in using data and a customer-centric approach to service delivery will help identify areas for need for added innovation and risk tolerance.
I would just say briefly on that point, often we talk about how much money we're spending and not the impact that we're having or the money that we're saving. And so there can be this penny wise and pound foolish approach to budgeting. And I think it's incumbent on those in the federal government to make the case, to go to the effort to say, look, this is how we can do this smartly. This is how we can ultimately save money, because it just seems like at the end of the day, we always get caught up in this idea of, yes, we're responsible to the taxpayer, so therefore we're going to take the easiest route, rather than saying, this may take a few more steps, or it may take an effort to justify why we need to spend more. I remember getting dinged by an IG because I spent a lot of money on an elaborate seating system for a cultural center at an embassy overseas. And they said, well, you could just buy plastic chairs and folding chairs and put them out. And I said, if we want people to watch our propaganda, we're going to make it that uncomfortable for them? I mean, at some point we have to apply, and I would bring in, again, the private sector perspective here. Sometimes we spend a lot of money on things because it's going to help us generate more money, or it's going to deliver a better result. So how do we apply some of that thinking into the federal space? And I certainly took issue with NIG suggesting that we should just buy some cheap seats. Yes, they are momentarily going to be cheaper, but I guarantee you I'm not going to get the minister or the deputy minister or the influential folks that I needed in that room to watch our propaganda because we got some plastic folding chairs.
Thanks, Brett. We're running out of time. It's amazing with the kind of panels we have and the kind of attendees, how time flies. But let me throw it back to you, Michelle, to bring us to a close.
Sure. So we started off by asking the question of is the government still relevant? And maybe we're in the post-America phase in the history. If we are with Brett, I think we heard everyone say government still can be relevant. We have some technology challenges. We need to have some mindset changes to be more effective. We definitely need some performance management, so all the cogs of the world speak up and we take initiative. I'm wondering, from each of the panelists, is there one or two other suggestions you would have of how we can make sure, even if we're in post-American, we have to work better with partners, whether they're local or international? What are one or two other things that should be on our radar so the government is even more relevant in 2030? And I'll start with Boyden.
Thank you. Well, the wins of our discussion here at the end talked about risk tolerance and how there was a need to have more of it. And I would like to flip that and say, for the most part, the culture that I see is really intolerant of leaders who aren't taking risks. I don't go to meetings where they aren't asking for creative solutions or where the public isn't demanding more from us, whether it's through the media. And so we really can't afford to not take risks. And whenever I get a little bit complacent in my thinking, I think of something that one of my employees said to me, which is, my goal is to bring you recommendations that take you to the threshold of your own risk tolerance. I want to bring you things that you are going to say no to because they are outside of your comfort zone. I don't want to bring things to you that are softballs for you to hit. And so I try to bring that to my own bosses and try and suggest things that they are going to say no to, because that's really where I am going to be pushing the envelope or doing my job. I don't hear people getting promoted because they are maintaining the status quo. I hear people making a name for themselves, if that's what you're about, as opposed to just being a good public servant. If that's what you're about, I hear people making a name for themselves because they're doing things differently.
Thanks. Krista.
Yeah, so I think that that's a good point. I think risk actually is a really good theme that has come across this entire conversation. And so I agree with what Boyden said, but I also think that I think that in order for us to stay relevant, we need to constantly challenge our own thinking, right? So to my earlier comment, I'm not a cog. I refuse to be a cog, right? I think we should all refuse to just be cogs, right? I mean, we need to collaborate, we need to work with each other, but I think we need to be the stars of our own careers. And in that way, we become kind of the stars of how we make change in the federal government. And I think that we need to, we don't just do that through throwing out random things, right? We need to be methodical in our approach, right? Bring data, bring evidence, bring experimentation to the table. And that is what is going to drive us forward. And that is what is going to drive us to being continually relevant.
Brian.
Yeah, so I think two things. One, to the individuals that are at the lower levels, to find a counterpart within the federal government to communicate with and to collaborate with, to what Brett was saying, even if it's just a conversation. I have a friend who works for the federal or the state level government in Florida. Him and I collaborate and we bounce ideas off each other for projects. And that has helped us move our own projects forward. You know, even though it's not a formal agreement or anything, it's just two people having a conversation. Hey, I have this problem with this data set. I have this problem with this, you know, this project that I'm working on. What approaches do you think I should take? Or let me just walk through this calculation with you, and does it make sense to you? What am I missing? And then to the leaders, I would say and this was mentioned before, is to invest in your greatest asset, which is not your hardware or your software, but it's your workforce. It's the people that know your agency. What they need is to also understand the data, or maybe you have, you know, rather than bringing someone in that understands data analytics and really understands machine learning and AI, but doesn't understand your agency. If you can bring up the power of understanding artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics to someone who also understands the agency goals and the direction the agency is trying to go, you can really get the most bang for your buck as far as where you're investing your money in.
Thank you, Brett.
I guess I would leave you with the thought that we in the federal workforce, and I still associate myself for the purposes of this conversation as part of the federal workforce, don't do a great job explaining what we are accomplishing. And sure, there are traditional means of, the press release and the podium and even social media. But there are so many touch points that even in a small office at a low level of the government that we have with the outside, with the people we're meeting with, even the information that we're preparing, we can all do a better job of showing and not just telling. How can we visualize it? How can we make it simpler? How can we make it stickier? And I think the more that we do that, the more support that you will find, both within the government, because people better understand it, outside of the government. And I think we are in a unique moment right now with the new administration, and I would argue also with an appreciation, a renewed appreciation for the federal workforce. So let's seize this moment for everything we're doing on COVID, for everything we're doing on economic recovery, for everything we're doing to overcome enormous challenges, and make sure that you take the time to share and to show that, because it will help pay dividends in the long run.
Thank you, Sasha.
Yes, thank you. And it was, I was thinking exactly how Brett was thinking to finish here in terms of communication, right? Not just to stay relevant, but to rebuild the trust for the American people with the US government. I think communication, as Brett said, at every level. And for me, that's at the individual level. I mean, I talk to so many feds, right? We sort of lovingly say COG here, and they're like, oh, I'm just do whatever. And even at an individual level, being more open with your communities about what you do and the impact it has, all the way up to the organizational level. And I'm really interested and passionate about agencies thinking differently about the way they communicate organizationally in the old school way, right? Of the Office of Congressional Affairs talks to Congress and the press office talks to the press. And, you have these sort of sectored out communication components. It just doesn't cut it, right? The world's too connected, and that departments and agencies at an organizational level, to Brett's point, need to think about how they're telling their story, how it's aligning across these audiences. And that's going to make a humongous difference, both in relevance and in trust.
Well, I want to thank the panel. You are getting so many compliments, all of them so well deserved in the chat. I want to thank Reggie for helping out today, and thank you for everyone for your contributions by putting your comments and questions for the panel in the chat. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Michelle. Great job.